Most of us want to stay informed, really understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But wading through everything, all the reports, it's a lot.
It really is. Takes time.
Right. So that's what we're doing today. We're diving into this recent meeting between President Trump and President Bukele from El Salvador.
And specifically this, well, controversial U.S. strategy involving deporting people to El Salvador.
Yeah, exactly. It's got a lot of layers.
Yeah.
So to unpack this, we've looked at a few different places.
We have news reports like from the Times of India, Al Jazeera.
Uh-huh. And official stuff too, right, for the State Department.
Yes, and then also analysis from groups like Human Rights Watch and WLOA, the Washington Office on Latin America.
Okay, so a pretty broad range of perspectives.
That's the idea, trying to get a full picture, Each source adds something important.
So our mission here really is to give you the essentials of this whole situation.
Yeah, what the agreement actually is, what the big concerns are.
And what it might all mean down the line. We want you to get the core of it without getting totally bogged down.
Right. Let's jump in.
Okay, so this agreement. President Trump hosted President Bukele, just this past Monday? April 14th.
That's right, Monday. And it seems El Salvador has become, well, one source called it a critical linchpin in the administration's deportation plans.
A linchpin. Okay,
Yeah.
how so?
Well, since March, so just recently, El Salvador has apparently taken in over 200 Venezuelan immigrants from the U.S.
Venezuelans, sent from the U.S. to El Salvador.
Exactly. And the administration's claim is that these individuals have ties to gangs like MS-13 or Tren de Aragua.
Wow, okay. And where are they being held in El Salvador?
They're being sent to CICOT. That's El Salvador's maximum security prison built specifically for gang members near San Salvador.
The one Bukele built for his own gang crackdown.
That's the one. It's directly linked to his big anti-gang push there.
And is there money changing hands? I mean, is the U.S. paying for this?
Yes. The reports say the U.S. will pay El Salvador about $6 million to house these Venezuelans for a year.
$6 million. Okay. Not a huge amount for the U.S. budget, maybe, but probably significant for El Salvador.
Oh, absolutely. It likely makes a real difference to their security budget. So there's definitely, a financial angle to their cooperation here.
And Bukele apparently offered more. Something about taking U.S. criminals, too.
Yeah, that was reported as well, and offered to house dangerous American criminals, even U.S. citizens and legal residents. It was called an extraordinary gesture.
Extraordinary. And legally complicated, I'd imagine. Can the U.S. even deport its own citizens like that?
Well, that's a huge question. The sources we looked at suggest it's really unclear what legal basis the U.S. could use to deport its own citizens or legal residents to another country, even if they've committed crimes.
Okay. And there's another part to this deal, too, isn't there? Something about Salvadoran gang leaders.
Yes, exactly. The U.S. is also supposed to send some Salvadoran gang leaders back to El Salvador. Bukele's ambassador apparently framed this as an issue of honor.
An issue of honor. So it's not just one way. There's some kind of reciprocity.
It seems so. A mutual interest, maybe, in dealing with gangs, but, obviously using very different methods and legal system.
Okay, so that's the agreement. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing, legally speaking.
No, definitely not. There were legal challenges right away. A federal judge actually put a temporary stop to it.
Right, but that was overturned, wasn't it? At least the part about stopping it.
Yes, the Supreme Court weighed in and overturned the halt itself. So the deportations could continue, but they did add something.
What was that?
Well, the legal justification the administration is using is interesting. It's the Alien Enemies Act from 1798.
1798? Wow, that's old. A wartime law.
Exactly. It's almost never used these days. The administration claims there is a predatory incursion by Venezuela linked to this Tren de Aragua gang, using a law meant for declared wars in this context. It's a big deal.
So what did the Supreme Court say about that law?
They ruled that people being deported under this act have to get a chance to file for habeas corpus before they're removed.
Habeas corpus. So the right to challenge their detention in court.
Basically, yes. They have to have a chance to argue their detention is unlawful before they get sent away.
Okay, so that adds a step. A legal safeguard, maybe?
In theory, yes. But there are still questions about how effective that is in practice. Especially if things are moving fast and access to lawyers is limited.
Right. And that brings up the whole due process issue. Are people actually getting a fair chance to fight these gang accusations?
That's a major concern raised in the sources. Claims that many didn't get a real opportunity in a U.S. court before being shipped off to El Salvador.
Is there a specific case that highlights this?
Yes, the case of Kilmore Abrego Garcia. He was a Maryland resident, a Salvadoran citizen. Reports say he was deported even though a court had ordered against it.
deported despite a court order. What happened then?
The Supreme Court actually ordered the administration to facilitate his return.
Facilitate his return. That sounds a bit passive. Was there pushback on actually bringing him back?
There were reports initially suggesting it wasn't exactly a quick process. It definitely raises questions about accountability, when mistakes like this happen in such high-stakes situations. What real recourse do people have?
That's a really good question. And it leads into the human rights side of this, which sounds pretty grim based on some reports.
It does. Human Rights Watch, for instance, has reported that over 200 of these Venezuelan deportees have faced what they call enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention.
Enforced disappearance. Meaning what exactly?
Meaning they're being held allegedly incommunicado at CCOT, cut off. And crucially, neither the U.S. nor El Salvador has released a public list of names or stated the specific legal grounds for holding each person.
Wow. Held incommunicado. And didn't you say their families were told something different?
Yes, that's another disturbing report. Relatives apparently thought their family members were being sent back to Venezuela, not El Salvador. That lack of transparency, that alleged misinformation, it adds another layer of concern.
Definitely. And what about the administration's claim that these are all dangerous gang members? Does the evidence back that up?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The evidence cited in some reports seems to contradict that quite strongly.
How so?
A 60 Minutes report apparently found that 75%, three-quarters of the deportees they looked into, had no criminal record in the U.S.
75%.
And a Bloomberg analysis suggested it was even higher, maybe around 90%, with no U.S. criminal record beyond, minor stuff.
90%. So the narrative about them being serious criminals seems shaky based on that data.
It certainly raises questions about the vetting process, the intelligence being used, or maybe the definition of gang affiliation being applied.
Right. If the intelligence is that far off, you have to wonder, why the insistence on the gang ties? Is there another reason?
That's a critical question. Perhaps the definition of affiliation is incredibly broad, or maybe it's more about the political messaging around cracking down on border threats. It's hard to say for sure from the outside.
And the conditions inside that prison, CECOT.
The reports describe them as extremely harsh. Overcrowded cells, no mattresses, very limited contact with the outside world, including lawyers.
Lawyers, too. Wow.
Yes, and confinement for like 23 and a half hours a day. And maybe the most chilling detail, apparently no inmate has ever been released from CECA.
Never released. Let's start.
Yeah.
That raises huge questions about basic human rights, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Holding people like that cut off from legal help, it goes to the heart of due process and the rule of law.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about Bukele? Why is he going along with this? He's popular in El Salvador, right?
Hugely popular, mostly because of his tough-on-gangs approach. He's overseen, over 84,000 arrests in 3 years under the state of emergency.
84,000. That's an incredible number.
So, cooperating on deportations probably looks good domestically. It reinforces that image of being strong on crime. And, well, it builds ties with the U.S. administration.
Does everyone in El Salvador support this cooperation, though? Or are there critics?
While his overall security approach is popular, you'd expect some pushback, right? Maybe from human rights groups there, or political opponents worried about the implications, the strain on resources housing these deportees.
Makes sense. And could there be other things Bukele wants from the U.S. in return?
That's quite possible. There's talk he might be looking for relief from that recent 10% tariff the U.S. put on goods. He could argue it's hurting El Salvador's economy.
Ah, okay. So using cooperation on immigration as leverage for trade concessions.
It's certainly plausible, a way to score points economically back home, too.
And didn't the U.S. just change its travel advisory for El Salvador right before Bukele visited?
Yes, interesting timing, wasn't it? The State Department moved it to level 1, the safest level. They specifically mentioned the drop in gang activity.
Level 1. That feels like a bit of a nod to Bukele's policies, maybe smoothing the path for cooperation.
It could definitely be read that way. A diplomatic signal, perhaps, acknowledging his security efforts and setting a positive stage.
Okay, so this agreement fits into a bigger picture for the Trump administration's immigration plans, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It aligns perfectly with the increased focus on immigration enforcement, the talk of mass deportation.
And what other specific actions are reportedly being considered?
Well, a whole range of things, according to sources. Declaring a national emergency at the border, bringing back Title 42.
Title 42, the public health thing.
Yes. Also, expanding the border wall and really ramping up interior enforcement raids, arrests inside the country.
And that Alien Enemies Act again, using it more.
It seems so,
Yeah.
potentially applying it more broadly, maybe even targeting MS-13 members specifically. Using that wartime law for a wider group, that's a significant shift.
It really suggests a more aggressive approach, maybe trying to bypass some usual legal steps. And didn't we touch on the idea of sending even U.S. citizens?
Yes, that discussion was reported, though the legal pathway is, as we said, highly questionable. But it shows the scale of the thinking.
And funding reflects priorities.
Yeah.
What about ICE's budget?
They're reportedly asking for a massive increase, something like $45 billion over 2 years, mainly for migrant detention.
45 billion. Wow. That signals a huge emphasis on detention as a strategy.
It certainly does, and it raises questions about costs, effectiveness, the whole large-scale detention model.
Hmm. And at the same time, they're rolling back things the previous administration did, like ways for migrants to apply legally.
Correct. Policies like the CBP One app, which offered a way to schedule appointments, are apparently being phased out or changed. The focus is definitely shifting towards restriction and enforcement.
Away from managing migration through legal channels, it sounds like.
That seems to be the direction.
And one last point. Concerns about oversight within DHS.
Yes, there are reports raising concerns that internal oversight mechanisms within the Department of Homeland Security might be weakening.
And why does that matter?
Well, less internal oversight could mean less accountability for how detention and deportations are actually carried out. If those checks and balances aren't strong, it's harder to ensure rules and rights are respected.
Right. Accountability is key.
Absolutely. Strong oversight is crucial for any law enforcement agency to prevent abuse and maintain public trust. Weakening it could lead to, well, less transparency and potentially unchecked power.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've talked about the U.S.-El Salvador deal, this use of the old Alien Enemies Act.
The serious human rights concerns, both with the deportations themselves and the conditions in CECOT.
Right, and how this all slots into the Trump administration's bigger immigration picture. It's definitely complex.
It really is. And I think the main thing for listeners to grasp is how all these pieces connect. The political goals, the specific legal tools being used controversially in some cases, and the very real, often harsh impact on actual people and their families.
You can't really understand one part without seeing how it connects to the others.
Exactly. They're all tangled together.
So, maybe a final thought for people to chew on. Thinking about everything we've laid out, what are the potential long-term consequences here, for the U.S., for El Salvador?
Yeah, and maybe even more fundamentally, what questions are still hanging out there about the people who've been deported, their rights, their future? It really pushes us to think about the lines we draw ethically and legally when countries cooperate on immigration enforcement like this.